time. All right, record, share the screen. There we go. I don't know why that's like that. All right. Can you folks see what I've got up there? You don't hear too many guys saying that, Dave, about their hair not growing. All right, good. All right, I just wasn't sure. My computer is acting funky. Okay, cool. So I want to pick up. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. If I was really cold, I'd want to have a lot of hair, but all right. Let's climb. Oh, wait, that's the wrong one, y'all. I apologize. I pulled up the wrong one. All right, one more time with feeling. Okay. All right, with feeling. Here we go. Okay, so we were last lab class, we were talking about the different views of the skull. We were going to go over what you could see in these different views. I'm going to finish up. We're going to talk about the sagittal view now. So this is the one where I told you that we're going to kind of cut into the skull, open it up, all right, from the side view, the lateral view. That's what a sagittal view is going to be. And we're going to see the endocranium. That's that big cavity in which the brain's going to sit. And then we'll also see the nasal cavity in this view. So when we're talking about the nasal, the cranial cavity, right, there's going to be several bones that are going to create this cavity. And we've talked about several of them already. We have the frontal bone, our parietal bone, and the temporal bone. The parietal and temporal bone are going to be the bones that you're going to see on the side. The frontal bone obviously is going to be in the anterior portion. Then in the back portion is the occipital. And then we've got the sphenoid and the ethmoid. We really haven't talked about those two bones, but we will go over that. And we're going to see two prominent sinuses or sinuses on the sagittal view. And that's going to be the frontal sinus, which is in the frontal bone, and then the sphenoidal sinus, which is in the sphenoid bone. So here is what I'm talking about when we're discussing all of these different bones. You can see here's the frontal making up the anterior portion of the sagittal cut. Then we have the parietal, which is part of the lateral. The temporal, which should be more the inferior lateral portion. Then the occipital makes up the posterior and kind of the inferior portion there. So all that's going to be to house the endocranium. Now your ethmoid bone is going to be found near the nasal cavity here. And then your sphenoid bone will be posterior just behind that. And that's going to be over in this region here. I'll get into those in a little bit. All right, and then you can see there's little spaces in some of these bones. Here's the frontal sinus. There's the sphenoidal sinus right down here. All right, so on the sagittal view, all right, we're going to see parts of the bony nasal septum. And if you remember from last time, I said that the bony nasal septum is made up of two bones. It's made up of the ethmoid bone, or specifically the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. And that's going to make the superior posterior portion of the nasal septum. And then you got the vomer, which is going to make up the inferior posterior portion of the nasal septum. I think of the vomer, it looks like an arrowhead that's bent. We'll also see, okay, the roof of your mouth, which is called the hard palate. And there's two bones that make up the hard palate. The anterior portion of the hard palate is going to be made up of the maxilla, but specifically we call that part the palatine process of the maxilla or maxillary bone. And then just behind that, or posterior to it, we have our palatine bones. Okay, so those will make up the roof of your mouth or the hard palate. So up here in the top left, you can see there's the bony nasal septum. It's made up of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone and the vomer. So you can see pictured nicely here. What the heck? I don't know what's going on with me today. Oh, there it is. You guys, oh, here we go. Okay. So here you can see, here is the ethmoid, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid that makes up the posterior superior portion of the bony nasal septum. And then just below it is the vomer. And that makes up the inferior posterior portion of the bony nasal septum. And then when we're talking about our hard palate, okay, this is the roof of your mouth right here. And so the anterior 2/3 of the hard palate is made up of the palatine process of the maxilla. Remember the maxilla, that's this bone that sits up here that makes up the upper jaw, forms part of the lateral boundaries to your nasal cavity, and it'll even be part of one of the bones that make up the medial boundary of your orbit. And then posterior, behind the maxillary bone, you have your palatine bones. So both the maxillary or maxilla and the palatine bones make up the roof of your mouth here. All right, another view, and I can't remember how many views we did prior to this, is the inferior view. I will tell you this right now. I feel at first glance that the inferior view is probably one of the most difficult views of the skull because of all of the bony landmarks that are located. Now, thankfully, this course, we don't require you to learn all the landmarks of the skull, or in fact, all the landmarks of all the bones. Okay, we require you to learn a lot, but not all of them. All right, there are several hundreds of bony landmarks and structures, all right, on the skull. All right, so when we're looking at the inferior view, imagine somebody laying down, all right, and you're looking right up through their body. So what we'll see, all right, on the inferior view, when we're in the front of the skull, or the anterior part, all right, we're going to be looking at the hard palate again. All right, we have the sphenoid bone. And off of the sphenoid bone, you have this structure called the pterygoid process. All right, and the pterygoid process on the right and left side have these little, I guess you'd call them plates, these vertical structures that come off of the pterygoid process. And we call those structures the medial and lateral pterygoid plates. I'll show you that in a moment here. But you're going to see this on either side of your hard palate. And there's several muscles that you utilize to chew. Call those muscles of mastication. Well, two of those muscles, and again, we don't have to know it for this class, but I'm going to mention them anyways. They're called the lateral and medial pterygoid muscles. And they're responsible for your jaw moving from side to side. So when you're grinding food down, like a cow when it's chewing its cud, okay, these muscles are responsible for that. And so they attach onto these pterygoid plates here. And so we name the pterygoid plates not for the muscles, but where they're positioned. Okay, so there's one that's more lateral, it's further out. All right, and then the one that's closer to the midline is going to be the medial pterygoid plate. I'll show you all this. All right, we saw these two neck structures, the jugular foramen and the carotid canal. Okay, keep in mind, the jugular foramen was going to be just lateral to the occipital condyles. And this is where the internal jugular vein and some nerves, some cranial nerves, all right, but the internal jugular vein, where it exits or is actually forming and leaving the skull, because it's going to be bringing blood back to the heart. And then just in front and a little bit more medial to the jugular foramen is the carotid canal. And this is where I told you that you have your internal carotid artery is going to pass through there, because that's going to be bringing oxygenated blood up to the brain. Okay, so here you can see, all right, here's our hard palate. And in the front here, the anterior portion, that's going to be the maxilla. And then back here, we have the palatine bones. And then if we go further back, right, you've got this structure here and this structure here. So this both together is the pterygoid process. Each individual one, the one that's closer to the middle here, that's the medial pterygoid plate. And then the one out here to the side, that's the lateral pterygoid plate. And then we go down here, you can see here's the jugular foramen. Here's the foramen ovale, excuse me, not the foramen ovale. All right, the foramen magnum. And then on either side, occipital condyle, occipital condyle. Lateral to that, we have the jugular foramen. And then now we'll move just anterior to that. Here's the jugular foramen here and here, just in front of it, there's the carotid canal. Okay, a couple other structures that we will see on the inferior view. We already noted the foramen magnum and the occipital condyles, all right? But I haven't talked about the styloid process. And we saw the styloid process hanging off of the temporal bone there. And so the styloid process is going to be this thin bony projection that's going to be just in front of the mastoid process. And the mastoid process is more of like a bigger, kind of more blunt projection that's coming off of the temporal bone. So if we look close here, right? So here you can see it's tough to see the angle here, but this is the styloid process. So it's kind of hanging down. There's the foramen magnum. Here you can see the styloid process. It's not colored, so it's a little bit easier. It's this thin, long, bony projection there. All right, you don't have to know about the hypoglossal canal, but here are the occipital condyles on either side of the foramen magnum. Okay, so keeping in mind now, we're going to be looking here at the base. Remember what we talked about last class when we're looking at the cranium, and we cut the top of the head off, the calvarium, we remove this, basically your skull cap, and we're looking down now into the inside bottom portion of your skull. That's the cranial base. So now we're going to describe all that to you. Okay, so there's a couple things that we're going to be discussing that carry on into other chapters. So it's a good idea that you learn this here, because when we get into like chapter 16 and we're talking about the special senses, you'll know what I'm talking about, where these structures are. Okay, so when we're looking down at the skull, we're going to go all the way to the anterior portion, and we're going to look at the frontal bone. And we're going to see the frontal bone is going to have this structure right in the center. And I want you to think of the frontal bone as the ocean and the ethmoid bone as an island floating in that ocean. Okay, so that's what it basically is. The ethmoid bone sits in the middle of the frontal bone on this view, okay, like an island in the ocean. And just around, all right, this one structure, and I'll talk about it in a second here, we have where the ethmoid bone is, we have this structure called the cribriform plate. And the cribriform plate is basically going to be the structure that has a bunch of holes in it. And so what's going to travel through those holes are going to be, all right, part of the neurological structures that are responsible for your sense of smell. So in the cribriform plate, you have these holes, and we call those most commonly olfactory foramina. And the olfactory nerves are going to enter into the olfactory foramina and go down into the superior portion of your nasal cavity. So the top portion of your cavity for your nose there. And in the center, the dead center of this cribriform plate, we've got this structure here, which is called the cristagalli. I describe it like a dorsal fin on a shark. But what we're going to see later on is it's an attachment site for some of the soft tissue structures, all right, that have to do with the brain. And we call that structure specifically the dural septa. More on that later, but that's just an attachment site. So if we look here, let me zoom in. Here's your frontal bone, all up in here. And so in the center here, you have your ethmoid bone. And so right in the, well, let me skip over that and come over this way. Okay. So here's your ethmoid bone, right in through here. And in the center, you have the crista galli. That's the dorsal fin-like structure that the dural septa attaches onto. On either side of the crista galli, you have your cribriform plate with all these little holes in it. And those holes are, I don't know if I have a picture of it here. Yeah, those holes are going to be the olfactory foramina. I've got some slides that I'll show you. It's just not on this slide. Okay, so keep that in mind. So now we're going to take a look at the sphenoid bone. To me, I think it looks like a butterfly. Other people have described it as a bat. So it sits just behind the frontal bone on the inside of the skull here. There's a couple different parts to it. You've got the greater wing of the sphenoid, which is down here, and then the lesser wing is up top. You thought of that too? Yeah, I mean, whatever makes you remember what it looks like. And then in the center here, you've got this structure called the Sella turcica. That means Turkish saddle. There's an important structure that sits there. It's called the pituitary gland. It's one of the glands of your endocrine system. So again, when we're looking at the internal structures of the cranial base, you have your sphenoid bone sitting just behind the frontal bone. And this is where we're going to see, all right, these wing-like structures, if you think it's a bat or a butterfly. And it's interesting because the greater wings are lower than the lesser wings. You'd think it'd be the other way around, but that's not the case. And in this, pretty much in the center of the bone, you've got this depression. That's the Sella turcica. And so the pituitary gland sits right down in here. And part of the pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus, which is the master gland. So where the pituitary gland sits, we call that the hypophyseal fossa. And then on either side of the Sella turcica, we have the optic canals in which the optic nerve will travel through. So here you can see, let's go back. Again, here's the sphenoid bone. So this portion down here, that's the greater wing. All right, this portion up here, this is the lesser wing. Sella turcica is right in the middle, and then on either side, here and here, those are the optic canals. And that the optic nerve is going to travel through those because it's coming off of the eyeball. All right, and so you've heard me mention this before. The petrous part or the petrous portion of the temporal bone sits right in here, and that's where your internal ear is going to be. The ear canal is going to be located here and here. So here you can see the temporal bone on the inside from the interior view, and then you can see the occipital bone here on the internal view. Oh. Okay, so that's it for the skull. So I'm sure a lot of you are like, thank you, God. So now we're going to go and do some bone identification. So if you have your atlas available, please pull it out. Some of this is going to be review because I want to finish up labeling this, well, not the whole skull, but I want to finish up what I have on my slides. So we're going to go through a few things here. Okay, we'll do the cranial and the facial. We won't do the facial bones today, probably. Okay, let's start off with the frontal bone. So these are all the different ways that you can see the frontal bone. The lateral, you should know what it looks like from the lateral view. The anterior view is the easiest one, okay, because it's the frontal bone. And then this one here, the internal view, when we're looking at the cranial base, you want to be able to recognize that, okay? Okay, so look on your atlas and see if all of these items are labeled and that they're labeled correctly. This is incorrect. That should not say that's not a foramen. That is a notch. Okay, notch. Okay, so all of that should be labeled. Okay, your forehead, that's the frontal squama. And then you get your supraorbital margins here in the lateral portion. Here's the supraorbital notch, another supraorbital notch. All right, now you can see where the supraorbital foramen is. Supraorbital foramen and the notches. You should be able to see the difference, and that is a notch because it's not a hole, all right, or a passageway through the skull. Okay, again, this is incorrect. I've got to correct that. Oh, why? I'm sorry. Keep pushing the wrong button here. This should not say foramen. That should be notch. All right, so you should have all of that labeled there. It's killing me. Okay. If I don't do it now, I'll never do it. And then I'll have no one to blame but myself and all of you for not letting me do this. Okay. Hooray. All right, all that is correctly labeled. All right, now we're going to look at the parietal bones. Easy. That's the parietal bone. This is what it looks like all by itself. Okay, when it's not with the other bones. And here it is, all right, on the lateral view. Not much to say about the parietal bone. Okay, there's really no cool structures on there. All right, the temporal bone. Now we're going to see a whole bunch of cool stuff, all right, when we're looking here at the temporal bone. So here's the temporal bone with some of the views, right? We have our lateral view, we have a sagittal view, and then we have, all right, an internal and external view of the bone when it's all by itself. All right, so you should have all of this labeled also. Now, if you notice down here, all right, we do have the external acoustic canal. It's also known as the external acoustic meatus. So both is acceptable. All right, you can also call it the external auditory canal. All right, I'll correct that. Okay, so you can see both of those structures. So the flat part of the temporal bone, squamous part of the temporal bone, this bump behind your ear, all right, that's going to be the mastoid process. This nice kind of thin projection from the bone, that's the styloid process. And then this opening here to your external ear canal is either the external auditory canal, you can call it that, or the external acoustic meatus. All that should be labeled. Here you can see in front or anterior to the external acoustic meatus, that's going to be the mandibular fossa. I know this is probably going to drive you crazy, but it's driving me crazy to see it up there. Okay, good. All right, so let's move on to this fella here. And now you're starting to see a little bit more open up. I'm not going to correct that. I am going to correct that. All right, I promise you that should be the last one. All right, now we have the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, which is part of the zygomatic arch. Okay, so that bony projection that's going anteriorly, that is your zygomatic process of the temporal bone. All right, lateral view. Here you can see now, I'll even draw the joint line here. You can barely see it, but this is the joint line between the zygomatic bone and your temporal bone. So to the right of that red line that I drew, that is the zygomatic bone. And that part of the zygomatic bone that the arrow is pointing to, that's the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. To the left of that line that I drew, that's the temporal bone. And where that arrow is pointing to on the temporal bone, that is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And then, if you see a big circle there, circling the whole thing, then the correct answer is zygomatic arch. Okay, zygomatic arch. Fun fact, breaking your zygomatic arch is horrible. I can only imagine, I can only imagine. One of my colleagues, he had an orbital fracture. And of course, my first thing that I asked him was did he fracture the zygomatic arch too? And he said no. But yeah, I won't ask you how you did it. That's a private matter. Okay, now we're on the inside of the skull. All right, and so you can see the petrous portion of the petrous part of the temporal bone. Petrous portion, petrous part, right there. Here you can see it on the temporal bone all by itself. You don't have to know it for this class, but in case you're wondering, you see this little hole here? That's the internal acoustic meatus. You have an external, well, there's the internal. All right, now we're on the inferior view. And so we're going to be looking at all these fun structures here. All right, so some of these should be labeled already. You can see the foramen magnum. You can see the jugular foramen and the carotid canals. Look at the relation to the foramen magnum. See, the jugular foramen is going to be lateral to it, and then anterior to the jugular foramen is the carotid canal. This actually should be pointing at the external occipital protuberance. Okay, the external occipital, let me just type that in there for you. There we go. Okay, the external occipital protuberance is that bump on the back of your head. Okay, you can reach back now and feel it if you'd like. Lab-wise on the exam, should we really hone in on the ones labeled in our atlas or all as a whole? Let's see. The ones that you were, well, if you're concerned about the exam, then I would focus on the ones that you have labeled in your atlas. Okay, obviously, oh, none of your atlas is labeled? Oh, all right. Well, you can go ahead and label the atlas. I would. I mean, that's the whole point. But I'm not telling you how to study. It's really up to you. If you're finding a way that works for you, fine. But if you think that there's something that will work better for you, labeling will help because as you're, okay, all right. Because as you're writing it in, believe it or not, you're imprinting that information into your short-term memory, and hopefully it'll find its way into the long-term memory. That's why I used to write out all my notes. Writing out all my notes helped me. Yes, it was time-consuming. I didn't really like doing it, but it was a way that I learned. And so that's why I encourage you to label your lab atlas before you come to class using those reviews in the lab content there. Yeah. Yeah, it's just a way, again, everybody learns different. Okay. So that was parts of the occipital bone. Here you're going to see all the different views of the occipital bone. All right, here's the inferior view. This is when you're looking down from on the interior cranial base view. All right, Here's the occipital bone from the lateral. All right, inferior, inferior. Oh, I'm sorry, inferior view. This is a superior view looking down on the internal. Okay, so let's label a few things here for the occipital bone. All right, there's the foramen magnum. It's the largest foramen in your skull. That's where your spinal cord is going to exit out and head into your spine, into the vertebral column. Just lateral, then there's those occipital condyles. The occipital condyles sit laterally. And then you can see the external occipital protuberance, that bump right there. All right, and then on this model, you can see the whole interior view of the, or inferior view of the skull, and then you can see the foramen magnum. And this is another nice view to show you, just kind of off the top of my head. Here's the zygomatic arch right here. Okay, that whole structure there. I don't know why that says that. All right, so you should have all that labeled there. Okay. Onward. All right, so, and then there's our two jugular foramens lateral to the occipital condyles, and then just anterior to that is going to be the carotid canal. Is there some type of activity to practice labeling like drag and drop? There is, Tanya. There is. It's going to be found in the course content. So remind me after this, after I'm done teaching, and then I'll show you. Okay, I'll quickly show you that. You got it. All right. So now the sphenoid bone. Now this is one of the new bones that we were talking about today. So we're going to now review. Look at this thing. It's freaky looking. Posterior view. I guess that really doesn't look like a butterfly. It looks like some alien bird or something. Okay. So here it is from the posterior view. Here's the superior view when you're looking down on it. Yeah, moth, like Mothra. And then this is a view that a lot of people can miss this, and I don't want you to. So look at the lateral view here. Here you can see the sphenoid bone, okay? It's kind of in between the temporal bone and the frontal bone here. There's the sphenoid bone on this view. Don't miss that, okay? And then you can see it here on the inferior view, right? We got the maxillary bone right up in here. Here's the zygomatic bone. All right, you've got your temporal bone. A lot of this is the occipital bone. So here is the sphenoid right through here. All right, so let's start labeling here. Okay, there's the individual sphenoid. This is the superior view. So there's the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone above this slit right here and here. It's all of this. Usually what I do is I outline a little bit. Okay, it's pretty much all up here. That's going to be the lesser wings. Okay, that's the lesser wing. And then the greater wing is down below. Like I said, I figured it'd be the other way around, but it's not, so don't get that confused. The greater wing is going to be the lower portion there. And then you can see the optic canals, and that's where your optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2. Don't worry, we'll learn all the cranial nerves. There's 12 of them. The optic canal contains, all right, your optic nerve. And you can kind of see the superior orbital fissure from the posterior view. Remember, we saw it on the anterior view in the eye socket, in the orbit, excuse me. And this is what it looks like from the posterior view when we're looking in, or posterior superior view when we're looking in from the skull. Oh, that's going to drive me crazy. Okay. I apologize. One more. Every semester, I always say I'm going to fix this, and then I don't, and now I will. And I thought I did correct a lot of the misspellings here. All right. All right, so now we're looking at the Sella turcica. That's this structure that the pituitary gland is going to sit in. Yes, you got it. Only for you. Nobody else. All right, so we got the pituitary gland is going to sit right in here. All right, so actually the Sella turcica is this whole structure here. That smaller circle, that's the pituitary gland. It sits down in there. Because when you look at it from the side, it looks something like this. I mean, like I said, it's a Turkish saddle. It's literally what it means. And so a saddle you sit down in. All right, now we're looking at the anterior view here of the sphenoid bone. And so this is the structure that I was referring to, the pterygoid process. That's this whole thing here. And then these little prongs that hang down, those are the pterygoid plates. So the ones in the middle of the page are the medial. And the ones in the lateral portion of the page, those are on the outside of the page, those are the lateral pterygoid plates. And they're just sites for muscular attachment. All right, so now you can see them here on the inferior view of the skull. Our medial and lateral pterygoid plates. All right, I'm going to show you a bone here now in a moment that might give you nightmares. This is the ethmoid bone. I like the bone, but it's a scary looking bone. Look at this thing. Talk about something freaky. All right, so here's the superior view. Now, this right here is basically this, except what we did was we just cut it out from inside of the frontal bone. So normally when you're looking down in the skull, this is the only part that of the ethmoid bone that you can see. Okay, the other part outside of what I just drew is buried underneath or within the frontal bone. So we've just carved it out of there. So that's the superior view when we're looking down on the ethmoid bone. And then this view over here, all right, this is when we're looking, where we pulled out the bone and we're looking at it from behind, obviously the posterior view. So again, when we're talking about the crista galli and the cribriform plate, all right, that is part of the ethmoid bone. So your crista galli is this center projection. And then on either side, it's tough to see it on this model, but on either side is the cribriform plate. And in the cribriform plate, you'll have the holes. So unless it asks you to name the holes, you're going to answer the cribriform plate on an exam. But it'll ask you, name the holes, then they're called the olfactory foramina. That's an ugly model, but same kind of thing. So this view right here is the lateral view of the ethmoid bone. And so you can see this structure here. That's the crista galli. So to me, like I said, it looks like the dorsal fin of a shark. All right. A crib with a baby in it. That's like Rosemary's Baby. If you know the movie reference. I don't know if anyone here has ever seen Rosemary's Baby. Right? I think it was made in the 70s. All right, so here's the ethmoid bone. And then, come on, computer. Don't fail me. There's the crista galli. And we haven't talked about these other structures. Well, we have talked about the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. All right, so this is a lateral view right here. And over here, this is an inferior view. So we're looking up. So basically, we are looking up into the ethmoid bone. So in the dead center, this whole structure, there's the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. So, okay, we've heard of that structure before. That's part of your bony nasal septum. And then we learned last class about the inferior nasal concha, and those are those scroll-like bones that help to spin the air around a little bit in the nasal cavity. Well, that's inferior. Okay, so right above that are going to be the middle nasal concha, and then above that, you'll see the superior nasal concha. So you can kind of see, here's the middle nasal concha right here. And this is the inferior nasal concha. And then there's the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid right in here. All right, so there you can kind of see it. Way better than that previous drawing there. And see the vomer is down here. Pretty much the vomer starts below that red line. And everything above that red line is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. Okay. So I'm going to stop here. I'm just going to pull out the other stop there. And all right. Let's do this. Okay. I just want to quickly finish up the labeling of the stuff that we haven't. No, discard it. All right. I'm trying to remember where I finished up with you folks. Ah, yes, I do know. Right here. All right, so we'll finish up by, let me just show you all these slides here, and then we'll be done for tonight, okay? All right, so here's our sphenoid bone, real quick. All right, sphenoid bone individually, not within the skull. All right, our greater wings of the sphenoid are going to be on the bottom portion here, and then you can see it on this model too. Our greater wings are down below, and then you can see it in this model too. So there's three different ways that I could show you the greater wings of the sphenoid. Then above are the lesser wings of the sphenoid. Here it is in this model. Okay, and then you can see it here. Those are the lesser wings. Those are the three ways that we could show you, all right, the greater and lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. And you can see where the optic canals are because we're right there near the Sella turcica. Now this one is kind of tough to see, but you can still kind of see it. I mean, we are hovering pretty far above, right? It's tougher. You can see it a little bit better at a superior posterior angle there. Okay, here you can see the superior orbital fissure. We saw it on the anterior view of the skull, right? But here now we're looking at it, all right, just on the sphenoid bone. And then the center there is the body of the sphenoid, that center structure right there. All right, so now is that structure, that's Turkish saddle, Sella turcica. This sits right there. It's easy. You can see it here on the sagittal view. All right, you can also see it here. I don't like the angle on this one as well because it's tough to differentiate. This one's better. This is our nice superior view. There's the Sella turcica, the sphenoid bone. All right, we've already seen that view. And then one more time. Okay, so those are all the different views that you can see the Sella turcica from. I had an anatomy teacher that was fixated with the Sella turcica. Don't ask me why, I don't know. All right, back to the sphenoid bone. There are the pterygoid processes that hang down. Okay, they're going to be on either side of your hard palate. And you can see the pterygoid process from this view, and then the lateral and medial pterygoid plates. Obviously, the medial is going to be closer to the midline of the skull. The lateral pterygoid plate is going to be more to the outer edges of the skull. All right, we just saw this. Here's the ethmoid bone. Again, I'm going to remind you folks, and in case I didn't, I'm going to emphasize it a little bit more tonight. When you are starting to go over this material, please learn the bones first. Be able to identify the bones. Then worry about the structures on the bones. Okay? So to me, that's the easier way to go about it. Bones first, then the landmarks. Here's the ethmoid bone. Remember, it's the island that sits in the frontal bone C. And here you can also see the ethmoid bone. Now we've cut it out of the frontal bone. And where you see those that dotted outline there, that is showing us the cribriform plate, the baby. Rosemary's baby. You forgot to say it's Rosemary's baby. Okay, so here you'll notice all these holes in here. All right, now you have the perpendicular plate that hangs down from the ethmoid bone. And then you can see it on this view here. So this long projection that hangs down, I told you, it's not a very pretty looking bone to look at. This is the perpendicular plate. Up here, that's the crista galli, to kind of give you some perspective. This is a posterior view. Well, I can't guarantee that. This might be, no, I'm almost positive that's the posterior view. So here's the crista galli. Here's the perpendicular plate. Right there. There's the crista galli from the lateral view. And you can't see it here, but because it's obstructed by this part of the bone, but the cribriform plate is surrounding this crista galli. And all right, this is the inferior view. Again, this would be the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. And then here are the middle nasal concha. All right, so now you can see, here's the cribriform plate, right, but you see all these little holes here. Either or is fine. You can call them the cribriform foramina or the olfactory foramina. I don't know. I mean, I use olfactory foramina more often. It's just because it's easy to remember and it tells you what's going through the foramen there. It's the olfactory nerves. So for your sense of smell. This one, you might not have that one in your book. Some of these you will, some you don't. Not all of these made the cut. All right, just a couple photos here of the bony nasal septum. Perpendicular plate makes up the top portion. The vomer makes up the bottom portion. Oh, clever. Well, yeah, you can do that when you're watching the videos too. Copycat. All right, that's it. See, I know I rambled on a bunch, but it's all good. And we'll get done a few minutes early. Any questions?